From your favorite podcatchers and our YouTube channel featuring scenic videos, this is Kaijuvision Radio, Episode 10, Ghidrah, the Three-Headed Monster. Hello G-fans and kaiju lovers, and welcome to Kaijuvision Radio, a podcast about the appreciation of giant monster movies
and discovering their historical and cultural value.
I'm Brian Scherschel.
And I'm Nathan Marchand.
And in this episode, we will be covering the 1964 film Ghidrah, the Three-Headed Monster.
Which is a very important film in the Godzilla franchise because it's a pivot point. From here, things are going to change dramatically.
Yes, the episode where everything changes. This will be a really cool one. I really love this movie, and I love Ghidrah, so this will be a really good episode.
I'm looking forward to it.
The related topics for this episode are China going nuclear, Japan during the Vietnam War, and Japan joining the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
All right, with that, let's move on to part one of the podcast, which is a short description of the film.
You're listening to Kaijuvision Radio.
Godzilla is at first a force of nature. He destroys a cruise ship and comes ashore in Japan. However, when he fights Rodan, he becomes more anthropomorphic, laughing at the pteranodon, among other behaviors. He makes his heel face turn when he charges heroically to save Mothra from Ghidrah and defend Earth. Rodan is initially a force of nature. He marauds through the skies and fights Godzilla for dominance. It's then he exhibits more human-like behaviors. While speaking with Mothra, he disregards the human's plight, preferring to squabble with Godzilla. In the end, he too becomes a hero. Mothra is summoned to Japan by the Shobijin to persuade Rodan and Godzilla to join her in fighting King Ghidorah. She is determined to protect Earth despite the overwhelming odds with or without their help. King Ghidorah crashes on Earth encased in a meteor. He attacks everything in sight as soon as he emerges from it. His only motivation is to destroy. Shindo is a police detective assigned to protect Princess Selena Salno, a ruler from Selgina. While normally poised and regal, she becomes an unemotional prophetess after being possessed by an extraterrestrial presence and seems to have no recollection of her human identity. She tries to warn humanity about Ghidrah so they can avoid being destroyed like her civilization. There are many James Bondian elements in the human plot. The interaction between the human and kaiju plots is moderate, increasing as the film progresses. The stories run parallel during the last third of the movie until the primary conflicts are resolved by the actions of the kaiju. Godzilla, Rodan, and King Ghidorah attack cities unopposed by the JSDF. There's debate in the Diet about what should be done to stop them, but the leaders never agree on a solution. Mothra fails to convince Godzilla and Rodan to join her in battling King Ghidorah, so she futilely tries to fight him alone. Godzilla and Rodan, inspired by Mothra's courage, come to her aid against Ghidrah. Their combined might and cleverness overwhelms the three-headed golden dragon, who is webbed by Mothra while riding Rodan and thrown down a cliff by Godzilla. Ghidrah then retreats back into space. As with any Sekizawa script, the story is relatively simple, although there is a subplot initially unrelated to the kaiju mixed in. Everything comes together at the end, though. The production value is solid. King Ghidorah is an incredible feat of design and engineering, brought to life with a combination of animation, suitmation, and puppetry. A new Rodan suit was created for this film, while the Godzilla suit from the previous movie was reused with minor alterations to the face and head. The climactic kaiju battle has the most elaborate choreography of any Godzilla film up to this point. This script is more serious than most of Sekizawa's scripts, but there is still humor, mostly in the monster scenes, to lighten the mood. There's a palpable, almost Lovecraftian dread and ominousness whenever Salno talks about Ghidrah's impending arrival. Though it does use some science fiction elements, overall the film was more fantasy than reality. The film builds on the crossover success of Mothra vs. Godzilla by adding Rodan to the mix, but it then veers into new territory by introducing extraterrestrials, space monsters, and a heroic Godzilla, all of which would become staples of the Showa series. Changing Godzilla was perhaps the boldest move out of all of them. The film is an expansion of style for the Godzilla series because it makes the kaiju much more like characters than forces of nature, with the obvious exception of Ghidrah. And it makes Godzilla much more of a hero. This film drastically changed the characteristics of Godzilla and changed the way the audience perceives him. The film was rushed into production after the success of Mothra vs. Godzilla and written as a direct sequel to that film. Toho intended to appeal to the burgeoning kaiju fandom by bringing several recognizable and bankable creatures together to fight an incredible new kaiju. When released in Japan in December 1964, it had an attendance of 4,220,000 and grossed 210 million yen. It earned 1.3 million when released stateside in September 1965 by the Walter Reed Organization. It is well respected by the fan base. The dub version of the film is about 8 minutes shorter. Several scenes were trimmed or rearranged, which caused continuity errors such as Godzilla switching between being in water and out of water when he appears in Yokohama. These changes were made to quicken the film's pacing. A few details were changed in the dub, such as Sano saying she is from Mars and not Venus, Mothra being referred to as a male, and King Ghidorah being called Ghidrah, presumably because it sounded more like Hydra. Also, most of Akira Ifukabe's score was replaced with music from American films. The film shifts focus away from the military to showcase a Japanese police department. A meeting in the Diet is shown for the first time since Gojira. Intrigue abounds as foreign agents infiltrate Japan in search of their target. Questions are asked about identity and mental illness in regards to Sano's claims of being an alien prophetess. Honda's trademark Brotherhood of Man theme is expressed in the defense minister's admonition that Ghidrah is a problem not only for Japan but the whole world. This theme is also seen in the alliance of Earth's kaiju against Ghidrah. The film expresses some anti-nuclear sentiment when the defense minister asks if nuclear weapons should be used on the monsters, which silences his fellow delegates. The film presents the then fairly new idea of ancient aliens coming to Earth, where they mingled with humans. This concludes part 1 of the podcast. You're listening to Kaijuvision Radio. Part 2 of the podcast is our opinion and discussion section of the film. So, Brian, I think we've made it no secret that we both love this movie.
Yeah, I love it. It's really a special one. Really big deal.
The weird thing is this wasn't the first movie to feature Ghidrah that I saw. I think it was either Gigan or Monster Zero first for me. I'm pretty sure, because I don't think I got to this one until a little bit later.
For me, it was definitely Gigan, because I was really pretty young at that point. I think I thought that this movie and the movie after it were the same movie or something.
I seem
Ghidrah is in the next one too, and I can't remember which one between this one and the one after this I saw first.
I seem to have vague recollections of having a similar experience. Maybe it's because I saw Monster Zero first, thinking it was the first appearance of Ghidrah, but they're talking about Ghidrah as if they'd seen him before, so I was confused.
I do happen to have around here somewhere a VHS version of this movie where it's called Ghidrah, the three-headed monster.
Oh yeah, it uses the original Americanized title, which kind of cracks me up. The funny thing is, when I read that, I kept thinking, so in the Showa Godzilla universe, the catchphrase would be "Hail Ghidrah."
Yeah.
How hilarious would that be?
I'm just going to take this time to state the obvious. Ghidrah is possibly the greatest kaiju ever, except for maybe Gojira himself, perhaps. The costume style that he appears in the Showa series, that's my favorite, the way that he looks in the whole of the Godzilla series. And the whole world of kaiju just would not be the same without King Ghidorah. He's my favorite, I think. And I think it's not only the three-headedness that makes him look so cool, but also the gravity beams and just the huge amount of destruction that he's capable of. And then there's the additional twist, starting with the film after this, that involves him being controlled by this wide assortment over time of evil entities and people, invaders, and all kinds of other stuff. He's kind of like a mindless tool of doomsday-level destruction. And I think the fans respect the power. I know I do. If some nightmare situation happened and Ghidrah suddenly existed in real life, I would be pretty scared.
Ghidorah is considered by most everybody in the fandom to be Godzilla's arch nemesis. He is to Godzilla what the Joker is to Batman, or Lex Luthor is to Superman. He's the most frequent villain that we see. He's the one that plagues Godzilla the most often, and as you pointed out, it's no wonder why. It's a brilliant design. It's based off of the Orochi myth in Japanese folklore, which was an 8-headed dragon, not 3. I guess they had to scale back a little bit. The 8 heads was probably a little much.
That'd be a heck of a costume.
Yeah, although Toho did make a movie about Orochi in the 90s, if I remember correctly. Not seen that movie yet, though. But anyway, so I can understand that. And it's interesting to note with this, we've been saying that this film is a pivot point. A lot of fans like to talk about how one of the characteristics of the 70s Godzilla movies is Godzilla's opponents got more fantastical compared to what they were in the 50s and 60s, where they say it was mostly, giant dinosaurs or glorified animals. And it was the 70s where they got nuts. I'm like, did you forget about Ghidrah? Ghidrah is pretty fantastical if you really stop and think about it. He's essentially a 3-headed space dragon. I mean, you don't get much more fantastical than that.
Yeah, the space monster. This is where that comes in. And I think, actually, before this movie was Dogora.
Yeah, I mean...
So that was the first space monster. That's funny.
Well, and kind of...
the release date of Dogora is before this.
Yeah.
Same year.
Yeah.
But, I guess Dogora is the first space monster.
Well, does Mogira from the Mysterians count? Mogira's a robot, but
a robot made by aliens.
Yeah,
so, I don't know. I don't know if I'd count it as a space monster.
He's certainly the first space monster in the Godzilla series. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think is really interesting is the film's presentation of Ghidrah in this. Because the opening credits, they kind of skip ahead to the end a little bit because they give you these quick little clips of the final battle, but you never see Ghidrah. I'm sure the posters and everything had him plastered all over the place, but there's a lot of mystery associated with Ghidrah. So you never see him at the beginning. Then there's all this talk about them when Sauno starts to talk about him. And then all the stuff with the meteor, it's very strange. We don't know what exactly is going on because it has random magnetism and it's growing. And then when you finally get to the moment when Ghidrah shows up, it is just spectacular. The meteor is glowing and rumbling and it ruptures, and then this fireball just erupts right out of it and then coalesces into Ghidrah. It's fantastic.
Yeah, seriously, the movie takes off at like 54 minutes in. And then the footage of Ghidorah's attack on Tokyo, which is, I think it starts like exactly 1 hour into the Japanese version. It's one of the absolute most memorable sequences in all of the whole Godzilla series is that. I mean, I don't mean because it's used as quote unquote stock footage later. That's not the point. But the actual stuff that's happening is amazing to look at. And like how the debris is like flying through the air and everything too, as the gravity beams are just destroying all this stuff so fast.
Well, and the other thing...
It's incredible to look at, though.
Yeah, and the other thing that really got to me is I don't remember feeling this way in my previous viewings before I rewatched it for the podcast. Maybe it was because I was really getting into all of the build-up stuff, because we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there was this incredible sense of just dread and just utter helplessness when you're seeing Ghidorah attack Tokyo, and it's because it's so violent and fast. I mean, it's not that we haven't seen cities destroyed in the previous movies. It's just that this one just seems just that much more intense compared to the others.
The destruction is just so fast that it sort of brings almost a different scale, and especially with being able to fly too. That's even more. The destruction can go anywhere at once. But it takes almost 39 minutes for Godzilla to appear. And I'm okay with that. Some might not be. The way movies are now, how it's like instantly action a lot of times, and we get to see everything at the beginning. But I'm okay with that. But Ghidrah isn't even mentioned by name until 50 minutes into the film.
Really? I didn't timestamp.
Salno mentions it to Takashi Shimura.
Oh, the psychiatrist.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I didn't timestamp when his name was dropped. I timestamped when he actually appeared. I didn't realize that. That's really interesting. It took 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm. But then it's really memorable though. I mean, she's there and she's like King Ghidorah, and then they look at her like, wait, what? Uh-oh, that sounds really, really bad.
Yeah, and then the way she tells the story, I was finding myself being more affected by that than I can remember in my previous viewings. Ghidrah, especially, I mean, he has a presence throughout the entire movie because of the meteorite and all the weird stuff going on with the meteorite, but there's this almost Lovecraftian dread associated with Ghidrah the entire time because of all the weird stuff that's going on, and then the way Salno tells the story of
the Venus thing,
yeah, or Mars, depending on which one you want to, which version of it you're looking at. But Ghidrah coming to her planet and ravaging it, and them being just powerless to stop him, and it gives this impression that Ghidrah is just this ancient force that just jumps from planet to planet, and whenever it lands someplace, it kind of rebirths itself, and then destroys everything around it, and then moves on.
Yeah, I mean,
it's terrifying, really, if you stop and think about it.
It's kind of weird. It's almost like Chrono Trigger with Lavos.
Oh.
Wow. Anyway, for those of you that don't even know what that is, it's a video game from the Super Nintendo era. Yeah, I'm really old, but yeah, I agree with everything that you said with this. I mean, the destruction is so intense, and it can go anywhere. It can go planet to planet and go all over the planet destroying stuff. Gojira is definitely not as mobile as Ghidrah is.
No.
Or fast. It can't fly. And so it gives the destruction like a much wider range.
Mm-hmm. And I will tell you that if I was charged with, say, writing a script that was intended to modernize Ghidrah, I would actually up the ante on the Lovecraftian sort of elements. I would take it even a step further with that, because let's be honest, the origins they give for Ghidrah later get a little bit ridiculous.
Yeah, this seems like the cleanest way to introduce Ghidrah, and I think the story does a good job at giving us the dread. It definitely could have done more, and now if you do a straight remake of this, you could really go all out, and especially with the design of it too, you could probably make it seem even more realistic. And frightening, I would say.
Also, take into the fact that just from a storytelling standpoint, the odds are really not in the favor of our heroes. It takes 3 monsters to defeat Ghidrah, and he's minimum twice their size, because I think he's supposed to be 100 meters tall, and Godzilla and Rodan are about 50 meters tall. So they're outsized and they're outmatched because it takes all 3 of them to defeat him. I mean, that should tell you how powerful of a threat they're facing right here. And it not only does it make Ghidrah more imposing, it also makes the movie feel bigger. I mean, if you look at this in the context of watching these films in sequence, it makes the movie feel bigger.
Oh, I agree. It absolutely does. And I think they build Ghidrah as such a big spectacle. That's what the whole purpose for seeing the movie was.
Which is a testament, I think, to the creative team that worked on this, because they put this movie together in 8 months. This could have been just another quick cash grab sequel like Raids Again, and instead it turns into this seminal, pivotal movie in the franchise.
That and this was the 3rd kaiju film that Toho released in just the same year. They released Mothra vs. Godzilla and then Dogora in the same year. And so this was when the studio was just really running at peak efficiency, where they just could, and I know at least 2 of those 3 movies were made concurrently. They were filming, at the same time for both of them. I think it was probably Dogora and Ghidrah.
I think it was Dogora and Ghidrah, yeah.
And so they would film a scene one place, and then they get a lot of the same actors, and they go to another place and film for the other one. So it's the studio was really working at very efficiently and really high production values. Besides Ghidrah, though, there's a big thing in this movie about just how groundbreaking this change that we notice is. And that's kind of why in the introduction, when I talked about how really the Showa series has 2 parts to it. you can find this line right here with this movie. This is the border area where we jump into and find a completely different kind of Ghidrah. I can't imagine every movie being dead serious as the first one. I think after a while it would just become old hat, and I don't know if anything else would have really come out of it. I think probably it just would have gotten boring, which that's not something you want to do. Or it's like a person who can't laugh at themselves. You got to be able to do that, especially if you're going to have a series last 10 plus years like this is now, because this is the 10th anniversary. At the time that this movie was made and that the decisions were made to go the more anthropomorphic direction, I don't know if in that decision process if I would have been on the side of actually doing this.
Really?
I think I would have been apprehensive and probably could have said, oh, well, this is really risky. Oh, well, if we go this direction, how are we going to be able to come back from it?
Are you talking about
going more comedic?
Yeah, well, okay, and making the actual shift? Because this technically isn't the first time we've seen Godzilla be anthropomorphic. We saw instances of it in King Kong versus Godzilla. So it's not coming out of total left field.
Not entirely, but really there's way more anthropomorphic behavior in this, though.
Well, I'm certainly not arguing. I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. I'm just saying that this
was where the decision was actually made, though, I think.
Yes, I definitely agree with you.
Where they decided to say, okay, now we're going to evolve Godzilla as a character.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also where he turned into a hero. I mean, this is the first time he genuinely becomes a hero. Is it possible that Ghidrah showing up as the arch villain and Godzilla shedding that role as the villain, I don't think it's a coincidence that these two things happen in the same movie. It's almost like we're separating that part, the creature part of Godzilla out and turning it into something else to have as an enemy. And then Godzilla actually fights that enemy.
So what do you think was the trigger that brought that on in the film? Because we had Mothra trying desperately to appeal to both Godzilla and Rodan to say, you need to stop Ghidrah. Ghidrah is going to destroy the Earth, and the Earth is where you keep your stuff, pretty much. You need to help me. And they say no. And then it takes Mothra getting the snot kicked out of her before you see Godzilla make that heroic charge. That was the moment. So what brought this on? I kind of wonder if it was Mothra's actions that finally did that. I mean, talk was one thing, but then to see this lowly caterpillar completely outmatched, just say, fine, I'm going to do it myself and go up against Ghidrah. I feel like that had to have played a part in it. Because it looked like it had an effect when Mothra said, I'm going to go do this. Both Godzilla and Rodan are like, really?
Yeah.
You're going to do this? You? Maybe if you were an adult, you might stand a chance. But right now? Wow.
Well, I think, Mothra getting beaten, I think demonstrated just how big the threat was. And then I think Godzilla reacted to that. Mm-hmm. I think that's the reason why he made that final total pivot towards becoming a hero. But I think what brought that on as a concept is, I think, more interesting, though, because you finally get to have this totally different concept of Godzilla taking place. And this is what really stays as the case for the rest of the show series. Because Godzilla doesn't show up as the enemy anymore in any of the rest of these.
No, he's sometimes perceived as such, because I get the feeling that it still took a lot of people time to think of Godzilla differently, as we'll see. It's actually, this presentation of Godzilla is one that's commonly believed by a lot of people who aren't necessarily part of the fandom. They do associate Godzilla as this defender of Japan. If they don't automatically go to the destructive monster, it's this version that they think of.
Yeah, and this version is something you almost have to create if you're going to create like a pop culture phenomenon that is Godzilla. I mean, if this part of this, if this pivot was not there, Godzilla would be way more one-dimensional, I think, and it would be too simple. And with this, it's like I'm not sure exactly how much of a risk, so to speak, they took in going this route. I think that it was the right thing to do, and I'm on record as saying that I like a lot of these films that are more humorous, especially during the Showa series. But I don't know if at the time I would have gone with it, because it is a very, very big departure from where we were before. But I think if somebody told me and sat me down and said, well, look, here's what's going to happen with the whole Godzilla thing as a brand, so to speak, down the line. And if we just keep doing the same thing over and over again, less audience, no matter what, and then Godzilla just ends up becoming irrelevant. And so I say, well, I'd rather have this evolution take place than have Godzilla just become irrelevant.
I would agree with you there. I'm honestly not sure how I would have reacted to this in real time, because I came into these knowing about, at least in some form, about these two different presentations of Godzilla. So it wasn't as shocking. I was actually more interested in seeing the film because I wanted to see the moment when things changed.
Since we're watching these movies chronologically, at least as we're doing this podcast, it is a really big change that happens. The monsters are talking to each other, and they have all these facial expressions too, and they do have a lot of human kind of emotions that they are giving off.
I just want to make sure I note on here, when we say the monsters are talking to each other, they're not speaking English or anything. They're not speaking in human languages. They're grunting and growling and such to each other.
Monster speak.
Yeah, monster speak.
Kaiju speak.
And I bring that up because there's actually this very humorous addition that's made in the dub version. It's not in the Japanese, where the fairies because they're translating for the human character so they know what the monsters are saying to each other. And they have this line where they say, "Oh, Godzilla, what language?"
Oh yeah, I remember that.
And I'm just like, what? It's not in the Japanese, but it's this really funny joke. So apparently, unbeknownst to all of us, Godzilla swears like a sailor.
Yeah. From what we've read, aren't Tsuburaya and Sekizawa the ones that went this direction, where they made Godzilla less serious? And then I think it was like Takeshi Kimura and Ishiro Honda that were a little bit more cautious.
I think that is certainly the case. I know Tsuburaya in particular said that, and Hiro Nakajima as well, when he was, because he's the suit actor for Godzilla for most of the Showa series, and when he was asked about which of the movies he enjoyed making the most, and Hiro Nakajima said that he really enjoyed making the more kid-friendly movies the most. And Tsuburaya, I think, was always a bit more of a lighthearted sort of a guy. So taking Godzilla this direction, I think is probably something he would have been behind. Sekizawa, most definitely. I think he would have no problem doing this. Honda was more cautious, though. But he was a good company man, and when he was given a project to work on, he went with it and made as good of a movie as he could.
Yeah, and Honda's been quoted as saying, yes, the Godzilla movies need to be enjoyable. So, I mean, that's what we're going towards here, is making the movies more enjoyable. But then we're also, sort of like we were talking before about how this series changes over time. This is one of those movies where we get a skin, or it's like a person wearing different costumes or outfits. Like this time around, it's the Bond movie. So there's very James Bondish sort of stuff going on. And then in the next one, it has like a whole lot of sci-fi sort of things thrown into it, even though it's not really a sci-fi film, but it has a lot of sci-fi in it. And then after that, it's like a young person sort of romp-ish movie.
Kind of adventure sort of
and
movie.
And then after that, we get a kid's thing. And so like but it's like a different. It's like an entertainer wearing different kinds of outfits and saying, okay, here's, this kind of a Godzilla movie and there's that kind of a Godzilla movie, as opposed to having particularly just thematic elements like Mothra and King Kong versus Godzilla and even Mothra versus Godzilla. Those have more thematic things in them about like corporate exploitation or those kinds of topics. And this one, we don't really have that. And instead, it's like, okay, this is a Bond. We're going to do a Bond thing now.
Well, it's kind of one part Bond. The human plotline is most definitely a very James Bondian, but it's the monster stuff is kind of like a weird paranormal sort of a film. I was noticing that because there's you get these two very different sorts of stories when you look at the two plot lines that are kind of running through this. It's not a full-blown sort of science fiction thing like what we'll be closer to with the next film, but there's a lot of strange things going on. Almost, I don't want to say Twilight Zone-ish, but that sort of paranormal story.
Yeah, like having it really hot in winter, kind of weirdness.
Yeah, like there's the movie opens with this guy who's supposed to be the president of a UFO club. I'm not exactly sure what that's supposed to mean, but whenever he's talking, I kept finding myself thinking, this sounds like the sort of stuff that you would see on those weird late night radio shows that I catch sometimes, like Coast to Coast AM and Ground Zero, where they're talking about paranormal things and conspiracy theories and all these, these fringe strange ideas. That's what I felt like I was getting when I was watching this movie, particularly with those scenes.
And the telepathy that the Shobijin display too.
Yeah, actually, I was really finding myself wanting Salno the alien to have more scenes with the Shobijin. I whenever they were together, I was really excited because you have these two weird paranormal sorts of characters who are together, and the Shobijin don't quite understand what Salno is because they can't tell the future. They're telepathic, but they can't tell the future, and all of these things. So they're even baffled by her. So I was just like, I don't know. I was just really excited, and I kind of wanted them to have more scenes together.
Well, they are definitely perplexed or unnerved by Princess Salno, the Venusian, because they have these looks, frequently. They're like, I don't know, 3 or 4 times where we see the twin fairies, and they're like, what is going on with her? And people think we're weird. We do not know what to make of this woman. And like, they're getting on that ship, and then she shows up, and they're like, oh boy. And everybody else is like, oh boy, Venusian's here. Yeah, it's interesting how there's like a more weirdness. The weirdness factor kind of went up with these kinds of topics, but they're very appropriate for the time that they were made, or that the film was made, because these topics were showing up in films. So it's kind of and like people were getting interested more in
like ancient astronauts, and ancient astronauts and things like. Because there's some element of the ancient astronaut thing in this as well, because Salno tells the story about how her people, the survivors, escaped Ghidrah and then came to Earth and then mingled with the humans. So I guess the idea is that there's a little bit of their DNA kind of mixed in with everybody, because the implication is that their precognitive abilities were passed on, but they're kind of buried in the genetics. So the implication being that when this extraterrestrial presence came onto Salno, it tapped into those abilities that were in her, but she had no way of using them.
Yeah, that's true. I like the story though. I mean, it's a nice sort of story. I don't care whether it's Venus or Mars, but I mean, you can have, sure, like in planets that we find and are still finding, who knows if there has been a society that survived there millions or billions even years ago that died, at some point, or maybe, the society ran out of resources on that planet and went somewhere else even, who knows? But the idea of, what was Venus like way, 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 way before now. And it's like, well, sure, who knows?
And I think the implication we can infer from this is that Venus is the way it is. It's as hostile and inhospitable as it is because of Ghidrah.
Right, yeah.
And although that's personally why I actually have to give props to the dub version, maybe it's just because I'm an American and I've partaken of too much Western science fiction, but I actually like the Mars theory, the Mars idea actually more than Venus, because Mars makes more sense to me, especially since there's this long-standing tradition of there once being a civilization on Mars, and Mars has a greater chance of having a civilization on it at one point, and the idea being that that Mars is barren now because of Ghidrah. Makes total sense to me, because Venus has a very hostile environment. It's very gaseous and acidic, and it's much less likely that there could have been life on that planet.
Going back to the beginning of this movie, it's just funny. She shows up as the reporter, and they're instantly like, oh, well, I think someone has been here that's lowered our, possibility of finding.
Oh, we have a non-believer in our midst, scaring the aliens away.
Yeah.
What?
But she shows up to this thing at night, and they're all watching the stars, and then she interrupts everything with her skepticism and her brainwaves and all this stuff, and I thought, that's just great. I like how the camera does this zoom-in thing right where she says she's from Venus. Did you catch that?
Yes, I did.
It was kind of like dun dun dun, and I thought that was kind of cool. There, we'll be seeing a little bit more with, I think, camera effects later on in the Showa series. We haven't really had a lot of that yet, but they kind of get more artsy with the camera over time to just sort of involve the audience and help us through the film. I think if somebody showed up today and said they were Venusian and that they started predicting all this stuff, she'd probably become like a YouTube sensation overnight. But meanwhile, the fairies of Infant Island, they would by this time have already gotten like a show on HBO or something. Like they'd be way higher up in the food chain.
And see, and that's one interesting. Actually, I have two quick bullet points I wanted to make about this. But notice the huge shift in the fairies' attitude. Now there's something of celebrities. They're willingly going on Japanese television.
Not under duress this time.
Not under duress. They're not being forced to perform. So they're embracing this level of celebrity that they've been given, which is totally different from what we saw 3 years before in Mothra. It's an interesting shift. I kind of almost makes me wonder why that happened and when it happened and all of that. But and also I think it's interesting to note that what did they use as the setup to bring them on? These two kids showing up saying, we want to see Mothra. Well, we can't give you Mothra, but we can give you the fairies. I wonder if that might have been a little bit of an acknowledgement to the changing demographics of the audience. There were more kids seeing this now, so that's kind of like a mild acknowledgement of that.
Yeah, makes sense.
But it's interesting that you bring up, that if Salna was around now, she'd become this YouTube sensation. There was a series of novels, Godzilla novels, published by Random House, written by a guy named Mark Saraceni. They were young adult novels. And in one of them, they had a plot element that was similar to this. There was this teenage girl who supposedly could tell the future. She was foretelling all of these kaiju things coming, and she had a show on MTV. You remember this was in the mid to late 90s when this was happening. It was before YouTube. So she had this show on MTV where she's making all these predictions, and she became this hugely popular celebrity because of it.
Yeah, and meanwhile, like I said, the fairies would probably have like a syndicated show on television. They'd be way up in the big leagues because of their presence and their, everything. But then, the Princess Salno showing up as an alien, that's one reason why it throws them off so much. They're like, wait a minute, what's going on with her? I guess two other milestones that we have in this movie is this is the last movie that, or at least the last Godzilla movie that Takashi Shimura is in. And so
It is?
Yeah, so that's kind of sad. This is the last appearance. But then also we had the last appearance of the Ito sisters who play the Shobijin. Because they don't come back.
You know, the Shobijin come back for one more movie.
Well, they do, but that's not the Ito sisters. No,
it's not the Peanuts.
No,
which is tragic because they're wonderful.
Another thing with actors and actresses while we're on that is Akiko Wakabayashi. I mean, she's amazing, and she's the one who plays Princess Salno / Venusian or Martian or whichever version of this you're watching. But she is she's in this sort of Bondish movie, and then only 3 years later she's in You Only Live Twice as the Bond.
She's girl. The Bond girl,
and it's funny in this movie that she's dressed in all these mostly pretty frumpy outfits and everything. She's wearing that. What is it supposed to be? The fisherman's clothes? Or
yeah, what? It was the fisherman's clothes.
And there's clothes when she landed.
Yeah, there was a joke at one point early on where the guys are like, "Are you really a girl?"
But yeah, she's wearing all these frumpy things, even though she's clearly objectively hot.
Yeah, well, I mean, even when she's wearing all of her princess garbs, it looks all very formal and all borderline gaudy almost. Because the costuming they have for the characters from her home country look kind of ridiculous.
The little things around the necks.
Yeah, this is stereotypically European.
Well, I don't think it's supposed to be European. I think it's supposed to be. I'm not exactly sure what country Seljana is supposed to be, but for some reason I think it's Nepal or someplace in the Himalayas.
But anyway,
given the look of the guards and everything when that guy was sitting in that wicker throne at his desk.
Yeah, but anyway, so she looks kind of frumpy in this, but then you watch You Only Live Twice and you're just knocked out. My gosh, she is a beautiful, beautiful woman.
And she's still around.
Going back to the Peanuts a little bit here, they once again get to sing in this movie. And they get a brand new song. It's good, though it's certainly not nearly as memorable as Mothra's song. But the thing I find interesting about this is, while in some of these previous movies, I've been joking that it seemed like Ishiro Honda had this secret desire to make a musical because they look like these big, lavish musical numbers. Whereas in this one, it's more subdued, which fits the song, and it feels like a kind of like a weird 60s trippy music video almost, which was something that was being experimented in by a lot of music artists at the time, both in Japan and America and Britain. This was about the time when the Beatles were starting to make some of their movies and all of that, all of these things that became precursors to what we would call music videos in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, it's kind of like an early 60s music video sort of thing.
We've talked before about with the Showa era that it has a continuity, but it's a loose continuity, and they only really pay attention to it when they have to. They might make these small or subtle nods to previous movies, but this one is probably the most direct references to previous movies that we're going to see really for about the next 10 years in the Showa series. Because in this one, it's really testing the audience's knowledge of previous kaiju movies. You got to remember, this is way before home media, so it's not like everyone could just rewatch these movies right before the new one came out. So you have references being made to Mothra versus Godzilla, with them talking about the two Mothra larvae, but one of them died between the movies, and Mothra fighting Godzilla, and then you have them referencing not just the Godzilla movie, but referencing the original Rodan, which was from 8 years before this, because they're talking about Rodan being in Mount Aso, although they have to retcon that a little bit because it looks pretty obvious that the two Rodan creatures fall into lava and burn up, but in this one we find out that one of them survived and was just trapped inside of the volcano, which is a little bit odd, but I'll go with it. I've seen worse retcons.
That's the thing with continuity in the Godzilla series, though. They're thankfully not that just fixated on every little detail of all the previous movies. Thank goodness, because I think after a while it would have been like, oh no, there's a danger of being like, oh well, as you might remember in the last episode of Godzilla, or if they
previously on Godzilla.
Yeah, or if they had numbered these movies, which, oh my gosh, that would have been tedious. It's like, oh no, you have to see Godzilla 5 before you can see Godzilla 6. It's like, no, please God, don't do that.
But anyway, well, also going back to that scene at Mount Aso when Rodan shows up, I don't remember that actor's name. He was previously in King Kong versus Godzilla. He had a small part in that. He's a very funny sort of guy, and in this one, he talks a citizen who, his hat had been blown up by the wind into the volcano, and it's like, oh, I need to get it back. And so, well, pay me money, and I'll go down and get it for you. And then he barely escapes before Rodan pops out of the volcano. I have been trying to figure out for a long time who he reminded me of. For the longest time, I've been trying, he reminds me of somebody I couldn't figure out, and then I finally figured it out watching this movie. He's like a Japanese Don Knotts.
I could swear that guy was in Destroy All Monsters too.
Oh, he was?
Yeah, like
I'll watch
little
for him.
Funny part, like where they have in the English version, they have that one voice that they do that kind of sounds like you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
I think it might be him too. But either way, this guy, I've seen him in other movies too. Pretty good character.
Yeah,
actor.
he looks kind of like Don Knotts. Even has a voice like Don Knotts. I mean, you watch him in any scene, and then watch a clip of Don Knotts' Barney Fife, and they're very similar. Even their kind of style of comedy is a little bit similar too. So I'm glad I finally figured that out. Also, kind of talking about comedy and Rodan, there are points where I wrote in my notes watching this movie, like, Rodan looks like a Muppet, especially in some of these close-up scenes where they're obviously using a hand puppet to get the expression and everything that they need. So that cracked me up a bit. And also, it looks to me like a large part of this movie, particularly the first third, was filmed on location, because there's no way they could have recreated that scenery nearly as well if they were on a set, even with the best sort of matte paintings. So, but that was real. They filmed that on location, and I think it makes the movie look 10 times better because they did that. It's gorgeous scenery.
Yeah, and like the last part of the movie where they have to escape the town that's being destroyed, in the process of this kaiju battle, and it shows them walking up the mountain trails, shows them moving around in this area, and you can tell that it's obviously on location. It does look really good, but I mean, this goes back to these movies look a lot better just because of Toho scope alone. We get to see nice wide shots of crowds of people and everything reacting to this, and the extras that react to all this stuff, they're really good. I mean, they were probably maybe paid a little bit like the way extras were paid in the good old days of movies, but when their town is being destroyed and stuff, they are like emoting and it looks like they're actually being serious about it, as opposed to just some of these other movies later where it's like, okay, everybody, we're filming, run away from nothing, and like you see a couple people, they have to do a reshoot, if they see people smiling as they're running away from supposedly horrifying, kaiju and stuff. But this time around, they looked really good.
And actually, I thought that added some great gravitas. I mean, it added a little bit of bittersweetness, actually, to the end, because the Earth Kaiju win, Ghidrah is sent running, proverbially with both of his tails between his legs. But then everyone is saying, but our village is destroyed.
Yeah, and that actually means a little something.
Yeah.
This time around, yeah. Some of the other just funny things that I thought happened in this movie, and part of it's the Sekizawa touch, but like that part where Takarada hits that guy over the head with the wrench, and he actually reacts to it pretty seriously.
Yes,
and it's like, well, yeah,
it's weirdly realistic. It's not like how in Movie Land you hit somebody over the head and they just go,
yeah, they just
down. Pass out.
Yeah.
And this guy's like, oh, it hurts.
I thought that was a nice little touch, but then also the you already mentioned it a little bit, but the thing that I absolutely love is this director of the UFO club. I
love this guy.
That tiny little scene. The director of the UFO club said this, and they actually we're transported to this guy's office with the UFO models in it from Battle in Outer Space, and he's there, and he says that wonderful line. you may not know this, but, and that is fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. And then he says, there's another dimension and that isn't our dimension. And she fell between that dimension and ours. And he says that, and then boom, the guy's gone. And we come right back. And it's like, that is perfect movie science.
It's almost,
right there. It's not even trying to be science. It's like just, well, in case you didn't know, this is why that happened, and that's all we're giving you.
It's almost like those goofy cutaway scenes that Family Guy likes to do, Although I have to say, and this is why I say that's why it's like, this guy's so coast to coast AM. I mean, seriously, this guy needs a radio show. But actually, you ever stop and think that, the guy's kind of being presented as being a little bit of a crackpot, even though we're dealing with real aliens here, or at least disembodied aliens, which really is not only the first time we have aliens in these movies, it's the only time the aliens are benevolent in any sort of sense.
Yeah. It does actually, within the context of the movie, it makes sense because we have all this other stuff going on that's really similar, but it all just mixes together really well, actually, considering, I mean, you can't just do a little scene like that for any movie. You can't just be like, oh yeah, this one guy said that though, and you go to this guy for 30 seconds, and we're like, oh, of course, you that's not gonna, like, so many movie viewers now, especially, they wouldn't be able to handle a scene like this, talking about different dimensions and stuff, and then popping back out. They'd be like, oh well, that's probably get complaints, but I think this actually does work really well. Have you ever had a Blue Mountain Hawaiian?
No, but I really want one now.
I can make you one. I have the ingredients here. They're very good, but I'm partial to rum kind of drinks myself anyway. But they're very good. Yeah, I'll have to make you one. They're very tasty. One of the funniest things that I've found in this movie, at least when I rewatch it, is that part when it's about an hour and 17 minutes into the Japanese version, and Ghidrah lands on the ground, and it looks like there's like a shrine, like a Shinto shrine that he lands like either behind or really close to. And then there's this small crowd of people there when he lands. I don't know what they're saying or anything, but they're all like, oh, and then,
oh, I know what you're talking about now.
And then he starts blowing the hell out of everything, and they're like, oh my God, and they just run away. And I thought that was hilarious. It's like, oh, how cute. Oh, no.
I was like,
run.
Our God has come down finally. Oh, crap.
I'm like, oh, it's so nice looking. It's so stately. Uh-oh.
It spits lightning.
Yeah.
The climactic monster battle in this is quite epic. We've talked before about, the kind of the evolution of the kaiju battles that we'll see as the series progresses. But one of the things that I really enjoy about this one is how clever the choreography is in this. The Tsuburaya and his team really figured out how to utilize each of the monster's strengths to piggyback off of one another so that they could actually defeat Ghidrah. So you have stuff like Godzilla coming up behind Ghidrah and grabbing both of his tails so he can't move. And Mothra tries to use her webbing to entrap Ghidrah, but she can't aim it high enough. So then Rodan figures out, okay, you get on my back and then I will fly up so you have a better angle with which to web up Ghidrah. And then with Godzilla restraining him, Mothra is able to web him up so that he's immobile and can't really do anything. It's a really great testament to what they were able to do, especially on such a tight time frame. It's a memorable monster battle with, like I said, with incredible choreography. It's a great step up from what we have seen before. They were still figuring out how to up the ante.
So they do actually bring up nuclear things in this movie. Well, one, really. Like, it's just... They toy with the idea of using nuclear weapons against the kaiju, and they're basically like, well, yeah, that's a really big decision. They just decide not to.
Yeah, the defense minister says, do you want to be the guys who decide to use nuclear weapons on Japan?
Yeah, I'm not pushing the button. I'll let you do that.
Yeah, do you want to be those guys? And the response is silence.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't even remember if the defense minister says anything after that. I don't think they even come back to it. I don't think they come back to it. It's just like silence. I mean, there's no music or anything, which I think is answer enough. It's a striking scene, honestly. Very much an expression of how Japan felt about things like that at the time.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Regarding the ending, Godzilla isn't defeated or killed in this movie, so that's a really big departure from all the previous ones, as opposed to him being encased in big piles of ice or
webbed up or shoved into the ocean or disintegrated with the oxygen destroyer, things like that.
Yeah, instead he's the hero and he stays around. And then and nobody falls into the ocean in this one.
No.
Like we're trying to keep track of the falling into the ocean thing.
Actually,
and how often it's used.
I think this is the first sequel where that doesn't happen at least once, because it happens in the first fight in Raids Again. Mm-hmm. They both fall into the ocean. Then you have the weirdo, semi-controversial ending of King Kong versus Godzilla, where they both fall in the ocean. Mm-hmm. Godzilla gets webbed up in the previous movie and falls in the ocean. Nobody falls in the ocean this time.
Yeah, and then basically the four monsters fight. The three of them fend off Ghidrah, and Ghidrah retires from the battlefield, so to speak. and that's the end. And so it's a little different ending in this one. I think that about wraps it up for part 2, and now we can move on to our related topics. You're listening to Kaijuvision Radio. In part 3 of the podcast, we discuss an issue that is either brought up by the movie or was going on in Japan at the time the movie was released. So the related topics for this episode are China going nuclear, Japan during the Vietnam War, and Japan joining the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. First, we'll discuss China going nuclear,
which in this case involves their first nuclear test, which was conducted October 16th, 1964. The Chinese called it 596. With this, China joined the A-bomb club, if you want to call it that, and became the fifth nuclear power behind the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and the United Kingdom. It became the first of 45 nuclear tests that they conducted on the same location, I might add, which was Lake Lop Nur. The bomb that they detonated had a yield of 22 kilotons, which was as powerful as the Fat Man bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki by the United States in 1945, and as powerful as the Soviet Union's first nuclear bomb, which was detonated in 1949. China's nuclear program was actually started in 1955 on January 15th. Its formation was prompted by several confrontations with the United States, most notably the Korean War, the Taiwan Straits crisis, and the threat of nuclear blackmail. Specifically, nuclear blackmail involving Eisenhower threatening to use nuclear weapons during the Korean War.
In 1956, Chairman Mao said, "Now we're already stronger than we were in the past, and in the future we'll be even stronger than now. Not only are we going to have more airplanes and artillery, but also the atomic bomb. In today's world, if we don't want to be bullied, we have to have this thing." And so this goes towards the reasons why China did this. And obviously, one major reason why any power wants to go nuclear is deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is extremely important to have, especially if you're a country that is a little, on the paranoid side, but also if you're engaged in a Cold War in which you're just stockpiling these weapons up. But this was a little bit different than the dynamic of the Cold War. This was more so that China could deter the United States, but also because the Soviet Union ended their help of the nuclear program in China, this is also a way for China to say, we don't need you, and we can build this ourselves.
Yeah, because the Soviets were actually helping them for a while there. They were exchanging scientists, even offering to give them a prototype bomb to study and all of that. But Mao made the Soviets nervous. He had a very nonchalant attitude toward nuclear war. As brutal as the Soviet Union was, they still had a healthy fear of a nuclear holocaust, which is one of the reasons why the Cold War was a Cold War. It's because both the United States and the Soviets just weren't willing to shoot first.
And that's what happens when you have nuclear proliferation occurring, because, eventually not all of the states that possess nuclear weapons are necessarily going to be as careful or as open to realization that things can get really bad really quick, or that, these weapons could fall into the wrong hands. Another reason a nation gets a nuclear program is national pride and to express their national will, so to speak. And that goes along with a lot of countries, and China's definitely one of them, because Mao was able to get more support from his own people by doing this. So he's really shoring up the pro-communist party attitudes in his own country, and by looking strong and saying, literally, we're not going to be bullied by anybody. And so that there's that national pride aspect. Also, China thought that they should have just as much or more concentration of leadership as far as the communist revolution. In other words, they didn't want the Soviet Union to be the ones that are always dictating to the world what communism is and to join up with them. And instead, China was sort of saying, well, we're also in this.
In fact, the Chinese designation for this project was a way of kind of poking the Russians in the eye, because it was called Project 596, and it was so named because the project was started in June 1959, which was the month and year that First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev withdrew assistance to China.
There was also some fear in the Chinese Communist Party about Taiwan possibly becoming nuclear with the help of the United States. And so that was another concern, because that would have almost been like a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis of some sort, like where it would be us setting up an island with nuclear weapons really close to China that would obviously trigger their national interest. Also, there was a lot of confrontation still between Chiang Kai-shek-led Taiwan and the Chinese communists. And so it was another way to really get an advantage in tactical nuclear weaponry.
And being that Taiwan saw nuclear China as very much as an existential threat, they did afterward attempt to start their own nuclear program, but it never really came to fruition. They even tried to start an anti-communist force to make strikes against China's nuclear facilities, none of which received support from the United States, probably for obvious reasons. It would escalate the Cold War conflicts to a degree that I don't think the United States was prepared to deal with.
Japan was very concerned about this development because it showed that nuclear proliferation was occurring, which Japan is against nuclear proliferation, but also because China and Japan have had not very great relations, especially during the war, and so it's more of they realized that China was flexing its military muscles and that they were becoming a larger player in world affairs. And so this was upsetting to a lot of the Japanese.
The United States was aware of China's nuclear program and of the test, but they just chose not to intervene because they were obviously nervous about provoking communist China.
If you're going to take care of a problem, you want to take care of it before somebody gets nukes, not after.
The United States' real concern was that China would eventually develop more sophisticated weaponry, such as the H-bomb or ICBMs, which, by the way, were tested at the same site not long afterward, mostly because the Lop Nur is the only nuclear test site that China has. This did spur a lot of talks of non-proliferation between all of these nuclear powers, because the United States wanted to avoid China escalating the Cold War and the nuclear arms race more than it already had, and it also prompted the Soviet Union and several other powers to sign the Treaty of Non-Proliferation in 1968. Thankfully, China has maintained a policy of no first use of its nuclear arsenal since this test, which, given the era in which this was going on, is very much a good thing. if anything good came out of this, it certainly helped both the United States and the Soviet Union to, back down a little bit from their arms race, because the tensions were certainly high at that time.
Okay, so how does this possibly relate to this movie? Because we have the one book that we've been going back and forth about, saying that Rodan is the Soviet Union and, Godzilla is America, this is that, East versus West, and King Kong versus Godzilla. But with this, we have the possibility that King Ghidorah is China, and a new nuclear China. And there's been some back and forth between various writers and opinion people about this topic. I think it's quite possible that maybe because that was going on right around the time this movie was released, that was tapped into a little bit in the national psyche of Japan, but at the same time, there's nothing literal that I can really find about this.
Certainly not literal, like you said.
Right, because a dragon doesn't necessarily mean Chinese at all. There's plenty of dragon connections in Japan and other countries too. And so it's not like China had some sort of monopoly on golden three-headed dragons. This whole idea it still seems to be quite organically Japanese. And so because of this, it's like, okay, well, then what really literally in the movie does this? How does it reference that? And I don't know if it really does. But just like with Rodan, though, I mean, I guess you can just have a vague connection and not necessarily some sort of super easy thing for the viewers to be like, oh yeah, that's clearly China, you see, because I don't know if you necessarily need to do that in a movie.
Certainly not. And I think the only major connection you could probably make is that, just as you said, this was obviously something that was probably on the Japanese psyche at the time. It's Ghidrah presents this very powerful, new, almost overwhelming existential threat, not only to Japan, but really to the world. And that's really about the only sort of connection that I could make to it.
Yeah, another threat, which you got to just figure that for what you can, I guess. This is an interesting topic, though, because obviously Japan has been very anti-nuclear proliferation, and this is possibly, I think, the first time we've started talking about nuclear proliferation so far, because we've finally gone to a fifth country. Next, let's discuss the Vietnam War and what kind of role Japan played in the Vietnam War. Now, right in 1964, what was going on was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which the North Vietnamese fired upon some of our naval vessels, and that prompted a big escalation in the American involvement in the Vietnam War. But not very many people know about just exactly what Japan's positions were and what effect the Vietnam War had on Japan. And so we'll kind of go into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. While Japan was not directly involved in the war, they served as a launching point for the United States, most specifically with the bases in Okinawa. Since Okinawa supposedly was not protected by either the Constitution of Japan or the United States, the Pentagon took advantage of this and stockpiled huge arsenals of chemical weapons and nuclear warheads. There were around 80 facilities on the island, making many of the Japanese feel that all of Okinawa was a base. And it also sparked a lot of sentiment in Japan about whether or not even this peripheral involvement with the war, this indirect involvement with the war, violated Article 9.
Okinawa was really indispensable to the United States. I don't know if we could have kept the Vietnam War really going if Okinawa had not been had such a crucial role.
In fact, in 1965, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Forces declared, without Okinawa, we couldn't continue fighting the Vietnam War.
The concern in Japan was that because Okinawa had such a central role, that at some point China could actually attack the bases in Okinawa if the Vietnam War became a larger conflict, which, because World War II wasn't really all that long away from this still, there was a lot of worry about a World War III kind of scenario, and obviously that with the big strain of pacifism in Japan, they there were a lot of pacifists who wanted to make sure that Japan was not pulled into something.
Along with that, like in the United States, a lot of Japanese media was covering the war as it was going on, and the Americans' quagmire in Vietnam reminded the Japanese of their own quagmire when they went to war with China 30 years before, and it really bolstered the anti-war sentiment that was going on at the time in Japan.
And the international peace movement in general, there were a lot of peace protests. It continued on through the end of the Vietnam War with the intensity as far as the anti-war demonstrators.
Yeah, the Japanese were very sympathetic toward the Vietnamese, especially as the Americans were escalating their bombings of the country, especially because it reminded them of when the Americans were bombing their own country during World War II. During this time, there was a group that formed called the Bahiran, which was a coalition of hundreds of anti-war groups that had formed during this time. It was also called the Citizens League for Peace in Vietnam. They claimed, among other things, to have actually helped 20 American soldiers who were deserters to actually escape from Vietnam and then find their way either into the Soviet Union or into Sweden. And they did this by getting them passports, among other things. They also, interestingly, bought shares of Mitsubishi so they could address the shareholders there about their company's involvement with, in the manufacturing area, giving supplies to the Americans. And they also helped American soldiers publish and distribute underground papers and pamphlets that were against the war in Vietnam.
And that segues into economic issues because Japan, even though Japan it became very much allied with the West, they still wanted to be able to maintain trade relationships with other countries in Asia. And so there was at no point that Japan actually stopped trading with Vietnam during the war. And part of this was, despite the Americans probably would have preferred not to have that kind of arrangement. But again, that's Japan saying, okay, this is involving trade with us. It isn't involving you, and so we need to continue our trade relationships with whoever the Vietnamese government is at the time. And this was Japan wanting to be more independent in this kind of decision making. Despite all the downsides of the Vietnam War, Japan actually did do very well economically during that whole period.
Which is one of the great ironies of this era, and I'm sure it contributed to the unease there probably was in Japan at the time, where they still have very much a pacifistic streak in them, and they're not fond of the war. They're worried about getting involved in another war, but they're also prospering because of the assistance that they're providing to the Americans.
Just in 1964 alone, the economy of Japan, their GDP grew 11.6% just in that 1 year. And the whole 60s, as we referred to, the golden 60s, Japan prospered economically very well during this period.
Japan always encouraged a settlement with the North Vietnamese government, and they wanted to do it as soon as possible. To that end, they actually established diplomatic relations with North Vietnam in 1973. However, the Vietnamese government demanded that the Japanese pay an equivalent of $45 million in World War II reparations, which the Japanese did do in 2 large payments. And then in 1975, Japan finally recognized the new communist government of the unified Vietnam and established an embassy there in Hanoi.
Well, I think that gives our listeners a bit more information about Vietnam, from the Japanese perspective, because I don't know if that's really much of that information is out. You sort of wonder because Japan was, a lot closer to it than we were. And then, of course, about Okinawa. Our last topic is about Japan joining the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This happened in 1964. The organization, which was started in 1961, is an association of democratically governed advanced market economies to foster cooperation and trade. Japan was the first country from East Asia to join the OECD. The group is known as just a very selective group of countries, and so Japan joining the group made sense because they fell into this category. the organization fosters cooperation on economic, environmental, and social issues. This is just another indication, along with everything else that happened in 1964, of Japan joining the world community again and taking on more of a role in the international world.
Yeah, Brian, I think these last two episodes have shown that 1964 was not only an important year for Japan, but it was also an important year for Godzilla. You know, it's the only year where there were two Godzilla films, and you got easily one of, the most popular of the sequels was produced here. And then in another movie, we had the introduction of easily Godzilla's most popular foe and his arch nemesis in Ghidrah, and a lot of other really good films coming out in Japan, both kaiju and non-kaiju. So it was a really good year for Japan. And this was also about this time when I think the popularity of Godzilla as an international commodity, an international piece of pop culture was really starting to take off as well.
Yeah, and we're warming up to eventually the golden year of kaiju films, which is in 1967. And that was our peak of when every studio in Japan released a kaiju film during that year. And
you were seeing them on television. I mean, they were everywhere.
Well, I think that about wraps up this episode. Our next episode will be 1965's Invasion of Astro Monster,
a.k.a. Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. So I'm really looking forward to this one. If you'd like to get a hold of us and send us some feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is feedback@kaijuvision.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook.
Our podcast is available on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, Blueberry, TuneIn, Podcast Addict, our YouTube channel, and on our website, kaijuvision.com. Thanks to Audiophiliac for creating our theme and bumper music, www.fiverr.com/audiophiliac. If you like our podcast, please support us on Patreon. I'm Brian Scherschel, and I edited this podcast.
And I'm Nathan Marchand, and I'm the podcast webmaster. Sayonara!